Right, well, we've mentioned some of the outstanding missionaries, but in 1978, I had my first sabbatical, which we introduced in those years. And I used it to visit former students of mine in mission, World Mission. I had 6 months in 78. I went to visit 100 missionaries. Now, they weren't all doing magnificent and obvious work like a few I've mentioned already, but every one of them was really working, some with great difficulty. Some were really near breakdown, a few, but the huge majority made me feel intensely proud. And this was perhaps the strongest movement right from the beginning of Bible College. I hope a movement that we won't lose. Now, we've had other emphases, and they're right emphases, they're good emphases. I'll mention some of them when I mention Lausanne. But, and it's right that we be concerned with our home situation, with the poor and the poverty-stricken, and be concerned to work with the churches and to work with the community here in New Zealand. And that has developed beautifully. But there is a danger that we become parochial. It's very easy for New Zealand to think New Zealand. And I think we must remember we must look on a world. There was 1 year at least when New Zealand had the highest proportional number of world missionaries in the world, of any country in the world. The highest, above America. It hasn't got it now. Way down in the 30s now. Well, we've got to watch that. I trust that Laidlaw College will never lose a world view, a view of world mission alongside the local community concern. We need them both. Well,
it's a very timely challenge. Take us to Lausanne, 1974.
In 1974, Billy Graham called for a meeting, a convention of evangelists and evangelical thinkers around the world. I forget how many thousand, about 5,000 came to Lausanne in Switzerland. And I think that was a changing moment for the Church of Jesus Christ, that people started to think differently. We had a number of good plenary speakers. We had a plenary session each day, but the two speakers that stood out in my mind above all the others, head and shoulders, were two Britishers. One was Michael Green, and the other was John Stott. These two were magnificent plenary speakers, and they brought us new challenge, new ways of thinking John Stott, I was leader of the group from New Zealand. We had 20 that we'd helped pick, and we met every day and tried to think how to appropriate things we were taught in our own country. But John Stott spoke most interestingly, and he said, we must not get tied down in the shibboleths of theology. They aren't his words, they're my words, but that was the meaning behind it. And he said, you know, Jesus gave 2 commandments. We all know the Great Commission. It's quoted all round. Go into all the world, preach the gospel, in Mark and in Matthew more detailed. Go ye to all nations, make disciples of all nations, etc. But there's a second one. When the lawyer came and asked Jesus, what's the great commandment? And Jesus didn't say, go into all the world and preach. He said the first commandment, the greatest commandment is, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. And the second's like it, love your neighbour as yourself. See, that's the great commandment. You've got the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. And we've given up the baby because the way people spoke was, you leave all the social work, all the concern for the poor, all the political and other matters to the modernists or to the liberals. We evangelicals, we have to preach the gospel. We've got to do the Great Commission. John Stott said, we've got to do both. And we must not let those of a different viewpoint dominate. We must learn the important. Now that was a tremendous influence. We started one new mission from New Zealand, started that year from one of the men who was in our 20. That was international needs, working in different places. Tier Fund, of course, was the worldwide expression of it. World Vision had already started, but World Vision, and they took over from the traditional social gospel, so-called emphasis.
I think in 74, I had become a Christian in 71, and it was because of Michael Green. He came to Australia, to Sydney University, in 1971.
Well, that's very interesting
Yeah.
that I mentioned Michael Green.
Yeah, and he spoke, and I came to Christ because of his preaching.
Oh, yes. Oh, Michael was a very close friend. I tried to persuade Michael to consider whether he couldn't come to Bible college as my successor, and he didn't think about it seriously, and actually the faculty wanted him, but he felt the time was not right. He only had 5 years to go till he was going to retire.
He's still alive and active, isn't he?
Oh, yes.
You're still in touch with Michael Green?
Not recently, but he's been to New Zealand a few times now. Anyhow, getting back to that was my contact with John Stott, and of course, ever since then I revelled in John Stott's books. His books were balanced. They would look at a problem, any problem, even if it was from a totally different viewpoint from the evangelical viewpoint commonly held. And he'd think through it, he'd study through it, he'd write through it, and they were beautifully written. When he wrote his book on ethics, it was a godsend to me. I was teaching ethics.
Became your textbook, did it?
What's that?
Became your textbook on ethics?
It became as near to a textbook. I more or less discovered it when we began teaching ethics, and his book on Ephesians also.